Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 239, Tenochtitlan. Last time, Cortés threw his orders from Velasquez out the window. Maybe not literally, since there weren't any buildings in Veracruz that had any windows yet, but at least figuratively. From this point on, Cortés is gambling on himself. He is hoping that whatever comes next, his expedition is going to be so spectacularly successful that it will justify his decision to reject the governor's authority. For that to work, two things need to happen. First, the expedition he dispatched to Spain to lobby the king needs to be successful. There is, however, nothing he can do about that now. Second, he needs to get to Tenochtitlan and somehow convince Montezuma to become a vassal of the Spanish crown. He needs to add a huge swath of territory to Spain's ever-expanding New World Empire. And ideally, he needs to find gold. A lot of gold. Cortés, quite frankly, and to be blunt, needs enough gold to buy himself back into the crown's good graces. But to make all that work, first, he needs to get to Tenochtitlan. Cortés and his quote-unquote holy company set out for Tenochtitlan on or about August the 8th, 1519. The total fighting force numbered around 300. Of those, 40 were crossbowmen and 20 had arquebuses, primitive firearms. Most of the company wore some kind of armor, generally just padded cotton. But whatever they had, they kept it on them all the time, even to sleep. Along with the conquistadors went 800 Totonacs. Generally, these indigenous peoples acted as porters, carrying the equipment, food, and munitions. Most importantly, as I've discussed previously, Cortés took horses, 15 of them. Throughout the journey, Cortés slept little. There was much to do, and nearly everywhere the threat of death was a constant companion. While his boast, quote, "I shall not rest until I have seen Montezuma and observed the quality of this land," end quote, was certainly an overstatement. I think we can say he rarely slept in. Cortés's message to his men before setting out might not have inspired the most confidence. Quote, "To conquer the land or die," end quote, was the promise he made to his men. I doubt, though, that every man shared his commitment to do or to die. Most would have been happy to grab a sack of gold and sail back to Spain. The distance from Quempolan to Mexico Tenochtitlan, as the crow flies, is 250 miles. The route is varied. The first stretch is flat, hot, tropical, humid, and fertile. In the 16th century, it would have been heavily forested, dotted with well-cultivated plantations of corn. Then, beyond Jalapa, the land rises sharply to about 6,000 feet. The climate becomes temperate. This region is towered over by two mountains, those known to the ancient Mexicans as Naucalpan and Citlalpétl. The first of these is over 13,000 feet high. The second, 18,000 feet. The next stage of the journey is over a cold, bleak plain. It was at that time dominated by a salt lake and a third mountain. Between that plain and the city of Tenochtitlan, there lies a further chain of high mountains. There are volcanoes, some of which are named things like, quote, Smoking Mountain, or, quote, Mountain of the White Woman. Some of these tower up to 18,000 feet. The pass between these mountains, just under 13,000. And the land then falls away to the Great Lake of Tenochtitlan and the Central Valley of Mexico, whose height above the sea is 7,400 feet. The route to reach Tenochtitlan was obviously unknown to Cortés. Throughout the trek, he would be dependent on his Mexican guides. Some early sources claim these guides deliberately tried to lead Cortés to his death. Whether this was expressly true, certainly his guides took Cortés on a risky and unlikely route. The plan was to move Jalapa and then Tlaxcala. But in the 16th century, there were several massive salt lakes in this region that would have acted as a major impediment, to say the least. The whole region through which Cortés had to travel was mostly under the control of the Mexica. But the region was uneasy, to say the least. The region around the city of Cholula had played a pretty big role in the Mexica rise to power as allies. But since then, they operated much more like subservient vassals than partners in the same enterprise. Cortés's Totonac guides thought that going through Cholula was the best way, since it might result in more indigenous allies joining the cause. This was important because, as his guides bluntly told Cortés, if he continued traveling to Tenochtitlan without more allies, he and his entire company would surely be slaughtered. Not exactly the vote of confidence you want to hear from your guide. Nonetheless, I should point out that these guides went with Cortés of their own accord, so they had some confidence in the mission. Cortés was traveling in the late summer, so it would have rained every afternoon. This made the paths muddy and made it almost impossible for the party to rest. Montezuma received word of Cortés's movement as soon as his party left Campolan for Jalapa. The news threw Montezuma into another bout of depression. He did have a little bit of cause for optimism at this point, though. Thus far, Cortés continued to present himself as an ambassador. It didn't seem like he was an enemy. Despite his instincts, therefore, the Mexica Emperor consulted with his astrologers, prayed to his gods, but did not take any military action. By August the 16th, Cortés had reached Jalapa. Today, this city is only about 30 miles northwest from Veracruz. From Jalapa, the conquistadors continued to proceed up the mountains toward the Central Valley. Everywhere they went, for the moment, Montezuma sent instructions that they should be greeted as friends, and so they were. The path that Cortés took was later given the name Nombre de Dios. The path remains easily traceable today. Eventually, the mountain path flattened and widened out. But this wasn't a relief because, as I mentioned earlier, this area beyond the initial stretch of mountains is dominated by a series of massive salt lakes. So there was really no fresh water. The region, in fact, while a vassal state of Tenochtitlan, did not produce any food for tribute. Cortés sought to avoid this barren zone by going to the north, which was rough, but he saw it as less risky. Finally, on August the 24th, Cortés and his party reached the town of Zlata. At this point, Cortés was about 100 miles from the sea. The chief of Zlata received Cortés with courtesy and respect, as Montezuma had instructed him to do. He provided the conquistadors with supplies of food. Cortés then asked this chief if he was a vassal of Montezuma. The chief looked surprised. He responded, quote, "Was there anyone who was not a vassal of Montezuma?" End quote. Cortés told him that there were many people in the world who were not vassals of the Mexica. Montezuma, in fact, he didn't know it, but he was about to become the vassal of a much more powerful king. Maybe you've heard of him, Charles V of Spain. The chief then asked about horses and guns. Cortés told him that the horses could catch anyone they ran after, and that the guns could kill anyone at a distance the conquistadors wanted. To this, the chief could only shrug and admit, quote, "Well, they must be gods then," end quote. From Zlata, Cortés sent 4 messengers on to Tlaxcala with offers of friendship. The messengers were to say that he was coming in the name of Charles V, and that he would be happy to assist the Tlaxcala in their struggle against the Mexica. After these men left, Cortés stayed in Zlata for several days, resting and preparing for the journey to come. Cortés waited a few days for the messengers, but when they did not return, he continued on his way. He set off down into the valley with his men and several thousand Totonac warriors. As they reached the bottom of the mountain, Cortés was surprised to find a 10-foot tall wall that stretched from mountain to mountain. This represented the boundary between Tlaxcala and Mexico. The wall itself could not have done much for actual defense. It was more symbolic and spoke volumes about the mutual distrust between the two peoples. Cortés continued along the wall until he found a gate. At this point, he was at the head of the bulk of his forces, with a few horsemen. There they met a contingent of the Tlaxcalan army. The army scattered as soon as the horses were close, but Cortés's men gave chase. Cortés shouted after the fleeing Indians, claiming he didn't want to harm them. He wanted to be their friends. Yet, reasonably, they continued to run. Eventually, some of the Tlaxcalans turned to fight. Armed with obsidian swords, they slew 2 of the horses. Cortés collected his remaining wounded and held them back. They needed to wait for the rest of the army. Cortés buried the horses carefully because he did not want his enemies to know that the horses were not some mythical creatures. But at this point, the cat's out of the bag, and the Tlaxcala at least know that they were mortal. The reality remained that Cortés had been able to score a victory over a much more numerically superior force. The victory of a handful of horsemen against a large number of natives wasn't simply the achievement of the horses and their riders. It was also a consequence of Indian tactics, and it's important to note that's going to play a huge role in the battles to come. The natives had a tradition of head-on combat. In this sort of style, only the front rank is able to fight. When that front rank is cut down, the next just kind of steps up, and so on and so forth. If your opponent in this sort of situation has the stamina to maintain themselves, then it's very easy for a handful of people to dispatch hundreds or even thousands. This also makes artillery extremely effective. Now, killing from a distance seemed dishonorable to the Tlaxcalans, as it will to the Mexica. But such niceties were lost on the Europeans. They didn't care at all how the person died, just that they did. And the other crucial factor to keep in mind here is the Tlaxcalans, like the Maya, like the Mexica, aren't interested in killing on the battlefield. And this is going to be a major problem and disadvantage that they're going to be at this entire time. What they're trying to do is take victims for sacrifice, so they want to wound. This was a fatal limitation. They had incredible sharp implements made out of obsidian, so they could have dispatched the Spaniards and Europeans had they wanted. But because they held themselves back, it would be their undoing. Now, this was the first real battle that Cortés had fought since the Yucatan. The loss of the 2 horses was significant. But more significant was the realization that he might have to fight at all. The Totonacs had led Cortés to believe that Tlaxcala would make a willing ally. Now it seemed like that might not be the case. Still, without any other choice, the conquistadors continued on their course. That night, they slept out in the open, about 20 miles from the city of Tlaxcala. The city itself was small but densely populated. The total population of Tlaxcala, as in the region, was probably around 150,000 people. Tlaxcala was less a kingdom and more of a collection of towns allied against the Mexica. Once upon a time, the Tlaxcala had been powerful merchants. However, in the early 15th century, they came into conflict with the Mexica, who restricted their trading activities. Still, they were a proud people who convinced themselves that they were free, while in reality, they were on a political island surrounded by Mexica. Several times they had held out against Mexican armies, many times their size. For his part, Montezuma claimed he could conquer Tlaxcala whenever he wanted. He let them maintain their semblance of independence so that his people did not forget the need to be ever ready for war. Tlaxcala wasn't the only semi-independent region within the Mexican Empire, but it was certainly the most important, at least from a military standpoint. When Cortés's messengers had arrived in Tlaxcala, they had been ushered in to see a sort of council of elders. These men listened to what the messengers had to say and then dismissed them to debate the best course of action. The chief was in favor of accepting the conquistadors' overtures of peace, thinking that the conquistadors might be gods after all. The merchants, likewise, supported an alliance with the newcomers, hoping that they might restore their mercantile fortunes. The military commanders, however, did not want to take the chance. They argued that Cortés and his crew should be treated like marauders and destroyed. On September 1st, 1519, Cortés advanced towards Tlaxcala. Eventually, he came upon another force of Tlaxcalan soldiers. Cortés rode out to read the requerimiento, but said soldiers unleashed a volley of arrows and spears, and battle ensued. At first, the Spanish seemed to push the Tlaxcalan army back with ease into a ravine. But this was a trap. The Tlaxcalans had the ravine surrounded, and as soon as the conquistadors entered, they could fire upon the Spaniards from three sides. Eventually, the conquistadors were able to force their way out of the ravine. Their weapons and their horses helped, but this time, Cortés's Totonac allies deserved most of the credit. Cortés then built a camp, only to receive several messengers from Tlaxcala. They told him that tomorrow the council would deliver their complete decision as to what they were going to do with him. Obviously, Cortés and his men passed a sleepless night, constantly suspecting a night attack. But in the morning, to their surprise, the Tlaxcalans sent a huge amount of food rather than an army. Sadly, this was not a peace offering. The idea was that the Tlaxcalans were sending them food to sort of fatten them up in advance. Quote, "Once they are filled up with food, let us attack, and then we shall eat them, and in that way they will pay us for the turkeys and cakes. We shall then learn why it is they came here. If Montezuma is responsible for sending them, let him set them free. If they have come of their own foolhardiness, let them pay." End quote. The Tlaxcalans assembled their army on a plain in front of the conquistadors' position on the hill. They were so numerous that they seemed, quote, large enough to eclipse the sun. A battle then took place. Cortés later claimed that he faced an outrageously specific number of indigenous warriors, 149,000. Certainly, he was outnumbered, and it seemed like the conquistadors came pretty close to total defeat that day. Quote, "Only the simple use of steel swords saved them," recalled one Spaniard. There was more to it than that. All the European advantages played into their hands. The cannons, even if they missed, caused massive shock and confusion amongst the ranks of Tlaxcalan men. Those same warriors didn't have a clue what to do about the horses and the dogs. Moreover, the Tlaxcalan generals were jealous of each other and did not coordinate their efforts. And finally, the Europeans realized that they needed to fire their arquebuses and crossbows slowly. For each shot that landed, 10 different Tlaxcalan warriors fell back in fear. The battle ended in a draw, with each side pulling back, Cortés to the hill, the Tlaxcalans to the plain. The following day, Cortés embarked on another punitive expedition, this time burning towns, one of them with a population of over 3,000, killing many. Once more, his motives seem to have simply been to shock the local people by fear into surrender. He then returned to his camp on the hilltop just in time, since the Tlaxcalans were mounting another attack. The second day's battle was much like the first, with the same inconclusive results. About this time, Cortés received the visit of more emissaries from Montezuma, this time 5 or 6 chiefs, accompanied by servants. The emperor, Montezuma, they reported, rejoiced at the great victory of the Europeans over the Tlaxcalans. He was also delighted that Cortés was now so close to his city. He sent presents of thousands of pesos worth of gold, some cotton clothes, and several good featherwork pieces. Montezuma also passed on the message that he would be delighted to become a vassal of the Spanish king. Cortés was simply to say how much tribute he thought was appropriate. Montezuma promised to pay that every year in either cloth, gold, silver, or jade. But there was one problem. Montezuma begged Cortés not to come to Mexico. It was not that the emperor would not have been delighted to see these visitors, but as Montezuma explained, the road was bad. It lay through rough land, and furthermore, his city just didn't have the provisions. He just, didn't want the conquistadors to suffer. The same emissaries also told Cortés not to trust the Tlaxcalans under any circumstances. Cortés replied that he was determined to go to the city of Tlaxcala. Frankly, privately, he was very happy to find that the Mexico were on such bad terms with the Tlaxcalans. He often quoted, quote, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be brought to desolation," end quote. Famous quotation. The Tlaxcalans then held another general meeting after all these inconclusive battles. Now there was a dispute. A couple of the generals wanted to continue the fight. Several other generals believed that the conquistadors would be powerful military allies, that they should go ahead and form an alliance with them. In the end, the council decided to launch one final attack that night. Cortés anticipated a night attack and didn't give the Tlaxcalans the chance, attacking at dusk. This time, the battle ended in a decisive European victory. The Tlaxcalans were positively terrified at the sight of the horses and the sound of the guns. They barely held their ground, running back to their city shortly after the battle commenced. Cortés could now advance right up to the city of Tlaxcala. And he needed an end to the action, to be honest. Though, somewhat miraculously, very few conquistadors had died in action. Many had died of wounds or succumbed to disease, 45 according to some sources. Cortés ultimately did not deny these figures. The men were cold also. There was little food, and several were ill. People began to wonder what would be the outcome of all this fighting. If the Tlaxcalans, by the way, could fight so well, then how in the world would the Europeans fare against what would be surely a much more formidable Mexican army? And also, nobody knew what was going on back in Veracruz. Cortés's plans were obscure. Sure, he had a lot of confidence, but beyond that, there wasn't really a game plan. The people who had left behind families in places like Cuba, expecting to get rich quick, were probably starting to wonder whether or not this was all worth it. But Cortés was a person who had just an overwhelming amount of charisma, and I think it's crucial to understand that in this story. Time and time again, it seems like the odds were totally against him, but by sheer bravado, he pushes through. He told his men bluntly at this point that God was on their side. They didn't have to worry about anything. Neither had Alexander the Great nor Caesar, he said, to mention all the heroes that could have come before them or afterwards, had ever ventured to throw such a small force as Cortés's against such a large population as evidently existed in Mexico. This was sort of the St. Crispin's Day speech. This was the, everyone is going to remember us for how powerful that we're going to be. And, once again, it worked. He was able to calm down his men. He just needed something to happen to prove to them that all of this bravado, all of this gusto was going to pay off in the end. And luckily for Cortés, he didn't need to wait long for time to prove him right. One of the Tlaxcalan chiefs who initially opposed peace with Cortés showed up at his court, begging for forgiveness. He told Cortés that they didn't have any gold or silver, but they wanted to be friends nonetheless. Cortés did think about this for a little bit. The Mexica emissaries were still on hand, and they warned him, moreover and once again, not to trust the Tlaxcalans, that this was a trap, that they were going to kill him. But, as I mentioned, Cortés's men were hungry, many were sick, many were wounded. He couldn't continue on the present course of action without additional allies, and so ultimately, he decided to accept the invitation of the Tlaxcalans. He rode into the city, dismounted from his horse, and made a deep bow, embracing the most important elder. He didn't just accept their invitation to enter the town, he went with them. The Tlaxcalans proved to be dependable. They carried in the Spaniards all their munitions, all their guns, everything, and what followed was nothing but feasting and celebration. Cortés and his men entered Tlaxcala on September 18th, 1519. The Europeans were lodged by the lords of Tlaxcala in some, quote, very pretty houses and palaces, end quote. Cortés and his men would spend 20 days there. Now, by and large, the complaints of those who wanted to go home receded, once they realized, again, that the Europeans had faced a massive army and, again, hadn't, at least during the battle, suffered any casualties. The chiefs gave Cortés some information about the remainder of the approach to Tenochtitlan. While he and his men were over halfway there, they still needed to cross the mountains before reaching the Central Valley. This was helpful, but not crucial. What was crucial was that Cortés managed to stitch together the terms of a lasting alliance with Tlaxcala. Without their help, Cortés could not dream of conquering Tenochtitlan. With their help, suddenly, it seemed possible. And this is such an important point, and it's a refrain I'm going to come back to throughout the story. Most history books, if you read a relatively short description of Cortés's conquest of Mexico, especially anything that's written from his point of view, massively downplays the role that Native American indigenous people who allied themselves with the Europeans played. That was where the bulk of the numbers were going to come from in terms of the force that's ultimately going to take down the Mexica. Sure, smallpox is going to play a big part in this too, and I'll talk about that in 2 or 3 episodes down the road. But for now, just understand that if Cortés doesn't strike these alliances, conquering Mexico is not a possibility. Now, throughout his stay in Tlaxcala, Montezuma continued to send ambassadors. Cortés continued to treat with them as friends, and his goal remained, quote, to reach Tenochtitlan without fighting, end quote. The Tlaxcalans told Cortés to take the route through Vexocinco, because the people there were more friendly to Tlaxcala. Montezuma's ambassadors continues to suggest the conquistadors travel through Cholula, because those people were Mexican allies. Ultimately, Cortés decided he would go through Cholula, but he split the difference a bit, agreeing to the offer of new porters and warriors from Tlaxcala to accompany him. Probably his reason for going to Cholula was strategic. It was a powerful city, and he didn't want to leave it between himself and the sea. After all, Cortés needed an escape route, just in case. But the Tlaxcalans continued to warn Cortés. The Cholulans, they said, were conspiring against the Europeans. They were going to block all the exits and hurl stones down from above the moment that Cortés and his men were inside the city, killing him and his men. It was 25 miles from Tlaxcala to Cholula. Cortés left on October the 12th, accompanied by a sizable contingent of Tlaxcalan warriors. This force might have been as large as several thousand. The lords of Tlaxcala warned Cortés he would need every last one because if he met the Mexica in battle, he needed to kill every single one of them, quote, leaving no one alive, neither the young, lest they bear arms again, nor the old, lest they give good advice, end quote. The following day, Cortés reached the outskirts of Cholula, and several messengers came forward bearing food and various gifts. They feared, they told the expedition, that Cortés had been told many negative lies about Cholula. He shouldn't believe any of it. Now, Cholula itself was thousands of years old. Its pyramid, housing the temple to the god Tlaloc, can still be seen. It was taller than the pyramid at Tenochtitlan, making Cholula one of the most important religious sites in all of Mesoamerica. Estimates as to the population vary. Some are as high as 200,000, which are probably too high. But certainly it was the most populous site outside of Tenochtitlan itself. No sooner had Cortés arrived than he was beset by more messengers sent by Montezuma. They begged him not to go to Tenochtitlan for a variety of reasons. Everything from Montezuma would die of fear if Cortés came, to Montezuma evidently had a zoo of ferocious animals, who had this nasty habit of escaping and would tear the Europeans apart if they came upon them. Okay. After listening to these, I'm going to say threats, Cortés met with several high priests from Cholula to try and ascertain just what the heck was going on. After he bribed them and subjected them to some torture, they spilled the proverbial beans. Ahead on the road to Tenochtitlan was an army 200,000 strong. The plan was for the Cholulans to capture the Europeans and deliver them up to the Mexica. This army was, I guess, sort of a plan B. Because, of course, the goal was not to kill the conquistadors in combat. The goal was to capture them so they could be sacrificed. Cortés held a discussion with his captains, and they came to a decision and a plan that would have made Cesare Borgia smile. They called together all the lords of Cholula to the courtyard to the temple of Quetzalcoatl. There, Cortés confronted them about this planned ambush. Evidently, they admitted to it, but insisted that everything had been Montezuma's idea and that they had been merely acting on orders. At some point, Cortés gave the signal, and an arquebus shot out. At this, the rest of the Europeans, plus their Tlaxcalan and Totonac allies, stormed in. Over the course of several hours, they massacred everyone inside. Cortés later said that they killed 3,000 people that day. Certainly the spoils afterwards were considerable. Evidently, though, not all the Cholulan leaders died that day. Afterwards, Cortés brought the remaining leaders before him and laid into them again for their treachery. They blamed Montezuma again and swore to serve him faithfully from then on. Cortés pardoned them in the hope that he could make allies out of the Cholulans going forward. Now, oddly, here's just a little asterisk. Of all the atrocities that Cortés would commit over his time in Mexico, this event, at least in Europe, was seen as the worst at the time. Historians today remain divided over the whole affair. Some say there was never any plot to ambush the Europeans, and that Cortés essentially just made it up as a justification to murder everyone. Others say the planned ambush was very real. Still others argue Cortés only planned on killing a few Cholulan leaders, that the whole thing got out of hand. Regardless, Montezuma sent messengers the next day, apologizing for the whole thing. He blamed the Cholulans for everything, claiming that he didn't have anything to do with it. Montezuma told Cortés that if he did come to Tenochtitlan, he would be happy to see him. Come right now. Meanwhile, Montezuma busied himself with ways to prevent such an exigency from ever coming to fruition. The Empire of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, is only 50 miles from Cholula. The two cities are both about 7,500 feet above sea level. But between them, there is one last mountain chain and several volcanoes. Several paths run across these mountains. One path is more than just a pass. It's definitely the most difficult trek that you can make. It's a track that passes through lost villages beyond Cholula before reaching at just under 13,000 feet, a place which is now known as the Pass of Cortés. For it was by this route that the conquistadors made their first approach to Tenochtitlan. Cortés chose this route not because it was easy, but because it was the one he thought least to be expected, and therefore the least likely to be blocked by the Mexica. Cortés left Cholula around the 1st of November 1519. The Totonacs decided to return home at this point, which reduced the number of auxiliary forces somewhat, but not significantly. Cortés still had around 1,000 Tlaxcalans, and every source suggests that Cortés and his remaining allies were very confident as they left Cholula and made the final push for Tenochtitlan. From Cholula, Cortés marched to Caplan, a substantial town in and of itself. They told Cortés shortly, as he reached the town, that he was going to approach two different paths. One way would be blocked up by felled trees. The other appeared clear. They needed to move the trees and proceed down the blocked path. The Mexica planned an ambush down the unblocked and cleared path. So the next day, Cortés continued his march 10 miles up into the mountains. He was now several thousand feet above sea level. After resting overnight, they set out again on November the 2nd, and quickly came upon the fork in the road that had been mentioned. This is the thing that the people of Caplan had warned him about, and sure enough, one of the two paths was blocked by felled trees. Cortés turned to his Mexica emissaries and asked him why were there two roads, and why was one blocked. These gentlemen, fearful of their lives, that they should eventually reach Tenochtitlan, explained that the blocked path had been left so to dissuade people from going along it, because it was a windy path, less direct, and with bad stretches. Cortés insisted on going by that path, and ordered the Tlaxcalans to move the trees and other obstacles which had been laid across it. They made short work of things, and Cortés's army continued down that path. After resting for the night, the Europeans continued. The following day, the weather was a little bit better than it had been previously. Now, for the first time ever, the Europeans were able to look down from the mountains into the central valley of Mexico. Now, just inside this new territory, owned by Chalca, the Europeans were met by another delegation from Montezuma. This delegation was led by a nobleman who had been instructed by Montezuma to dress as the emperor and pretend to be him. Montezuma seems to have thought that maybe the Europeans would be happy to withdraw once they had, as they supposed, seen him. He was followed by magicians, whom Montezuma had previously believed would make the whole thing go away. He also brought a variety of presents: gold streamers, quetzal feathers, golden necklaces. Now, the Europeans, of course, were more than happy to receive the gold. One recording of their reaction reads as follows, quote, "When they were given the gifts, they appeared to smile, to rejoice exceedingly. Like monkeys, they seized upon the gold. It was as if they were satisfied, sated, and gladdened. For in truth, they thirsted mightily for gold. They stuffed themselves with it, and starved and lusted for it like pigs. They went about moving the gold streamer back and forth, and showed it to one another, all the while babbling. What they said was gibberish." End quote. Now, the Europeans were at first really impressed by this nobleman, and they asked their Tlaxcalan allies, "Hey, is this Montezuma?" The Tlaxcalans told them no, it was not. They then asked this gentleman the same question. He replied confusingly, quote, "Yes, I am your servant. I am Montezuma," end quote. The Europeans reportedly laughed, and Cortés apparently said, quote, "Go home, why do you lie to us? Whom do you take us to be? You cannot mock us, nor make us stupid, nor flatter us, nor become our eyes, nor trick us, nor misdirect our gaze, nor turn us back, nor destroy us, nor dazzle us, nor cast mud in our eyes. You are not he." And at least according to the indigenous sources, Cortés continued, quote, "Now Montezuma cannot hide from us. He cannot take refuge from us. Where, after all, can he go? Is he perhaps a bird that he can fly away? Or can he burrow under the earth? Is there somewhere a mountain pierced by a hole which he can enter? We shall see him. We shall not fail to look him in the face. We shall hear what he has to say." End quote. So needless to say, the delegation didn't stop Cortés. And so Montezuma, back in Tenochtitlan, again met with his Supreme Council. There was further discussion as to whether they should welcome the Europeans. Most of the major lords were against it. Montezuma seems to have, at least for the moment, decided once and for all that they should prevent the Europeans from entering his city. He told the men assembled, quote, "We must not hide nor flee nor show cowardice, and let us not imagine that the Mexican glory is going to perish here. We are now resolved to die in the defense of Tenochtitlan." End quote. Now all the while, Cortés continued to advance toward Tenochtitlan. On November the 5th, Cortés reached the city of Chalco. This was a small town on the edge of the Great Lake system. This was the first time that the Europeans had seen the massive lake that dominated the Central Valley. While Cortés stopped, Montezuma again met with his lords. Montezuma now seems to have gotten forlorn and fatalistic again. He told two of his lords as follows, quote, "O mighty lords, it is fitting that the three of us should be here to receive the gods, and therefore I wish to find solace with you and also to bid you farewell. How little did we enjoy the realms which were bequeathed to us by our ancestors. They, mighty kings and lords as they were, left this world in peace and harmony. But woe is coming to us. How do we deserve this fate? How did we offend the gods? Who are these men who have come? Whence have they really come? Who showed them the way? There is only one remedy. We must make our hearts strong to bear what is about to happen, for they are at our gates." End quote. Montezuma, for all this, continued to try to stave off the moment of their arrival, and maybe he thought the end of the world. While Cortés was at Chalco, the emperor sent another delegation. This was headed by 4 Mexican chiefs, who as usual brought more gold and more cloth. The emperor, they said, was very sorry not to have come to greet Cortés himself, but unfortunately he was sick. They, at the other hand, were at the Europeans' disposal. Montezuma was concerned at the hardships which they had endured in coming to see him. He had already sent to Cortés much gold and jade for this distant Christian king, and for the gods in whom he knew the Christians believed. He now once more begged Cortés not to come to Tenochtitlan. There really was no food for them. The road to it was atrocious. The best way of coming was by canoe, and that was dangerous. In fact, all the people inside Tenochtitlan were protesting against the idea of having the Europeans stay. If Cortés would just turn around, if he would just go home, these lords said, Montezuma promised that he would deliver him regular tributes of gold every year, deposited wherever Cortés specified. Cortés, for his part, offering his usual presents of useless glass beads, said that he was surprised that Montezuma could be so inconsistent. Now that he and his army had traveled so far and were almost in sight of Tenochtitlan, how in the world could they possibly turn around? How could they return? He was going to continue. And so the following day, Cortés reached Ixtalapa, the last city before Tenochtitlan. It had a population of around 15,000 and was only 5 miles now from the capital city. The next day, the 8th of November, Cortés started along the main causeway to Tenochtitlan in elaborate order, with 4 horsemen in traditional European armor out front, then his standard bearer, then a contingent of infantry with drawn swords, then a few more horsemen, and finally himself. The great broad causeway led Europeans to their destination at last. It was so wide that, according to Cortés, 8 horsemen could ride along it abreast. The European expedition, of course, made an immense impression. The Mexica were much impressed by the steel swords and lances, both of which flashed brightly. to say nothing of the horses and the dogs. The crossbowmen and arquebusiers were seen to be wielding their weapons and making as if to test them. Behind Cortés, his Indian allies made noises as if preparing for war, shrieking, hitting their mouths with their hands, whistling and shouting. But if the lake dwellers were fascinated, Cortés and his men also were in total awe. In front of them lay a city as large as anyone in the party had ever seen. Though Naples and Constantinople, with over 200,000 people each, were close. But the vast majority of people in Cortés's expedition would never have seen either one of those cities. Most had never seen a city any bigger than Seville. In the Old World, only the cities in China, which of course no member of the expedition would have known about, would have greatly exceeded the capital of Mexico in size. The Europeans were also impressed by the vast number of canoes which they saw on the lake, many of them large, some carrying up to 60 people, and all hollowed out of tree trunks. Many were paddled close to the causeway to allow their owners to have a good look at the visitors. The conquistadors thought that the numerous stucco-covered pyramids with their temples on the top, platforms for display of the shrines of the gods, on the islands as well as Tenochtitlan, were, in the words of one, quote, castled fortresses, splendid monuments, royal dwelling places, glorious heights. How marvelous it was to gaze upon them, all stuccoed, carved, and crowned, with various different types of merlins painted with animals, covered with stone figures, end quote. But Cortés and the other members of the expedition couldn't help but notice one other aspect of the architecture of Tenochtitlan. As they walked along the causeway, they would have noticed a series of wooden planks or drawbridges, which could have been pulled up. The purpose of these planks was to allow canoes to pass from one side of the lake to the other. But there was another, they realized, more nefarious purpose. The planks could be taken away, effectively sealing the city from outside attack. Or, in the converse, sealing those within. No doubt Cortés and his men shared a nervous glance as they rode across. About a mile and a half short of the main gate, the causeway ended and the houses of the city began. This was the traditional place for greeting returning heroes. There, a crowd of richly dressed Mexicans came out to meet the Europeans. They performed a lengthy traditional greeting and then went on together to Tenochtitlan. Montezuma, despite everything, had decided to meet Cortés. Whatever he might have believed about the man he was about to meet, the Mexican tradition of hospitality won out. Montezuma came forward on a litter with a canopy of green feathers and so much gold and silver embroidery it sparkled in the sun. The litter itself was carried by noblemen. Other noblemen busied themselves, sweeping the ground in front. A man walked before the emperor, carrying a stick to mark his authority. Montezuma himself probably wore an embroidered cloak, with a green feathered headdress, and on his feet, gold-decorated sandals. The litter was decorated with flowers, cacao blossoms, wreaths, garlands, and golden neckbands. The emperor was well prepared with presents. His welcome was given by another group of lords, assembled in 2 columns down the street. After all this was done, Montezuma descended from the litter. Cortés dismounted from his horse. Cortés moved and made to embrace him, quote, in a Spanish fashion, probably a hug. But Montezuma's attendant stepped in. In the end, the 2 men simply shook hands. According to Cortés and other Spanish witnesses, the greeting was very formal. Cortés apparently said something like, "Art thou he? Art thou Montezuma?" To which Montezuma simply replied, "Yes, I am he." After the formal greeting was over, Cortés and his men proceeded into Tenochtitlan. There, they would be housed in one of the royal palaces, and Montezuma told him that he would be back later on to see how things were going. Now Montezuma did in fact return later to the place that Cortés was staying. He then made a speech that Cortés would later report back to Charles V, and which has been a matter of controversy ever since. Montezuma began with a repetition of the words of welcome, as usual on all formal occasions. Quote, "Our Lord, you must be tired. You have experienced fatigue, but you have arrived at your city." End quote. What Montezuma said next remains a matter of controversy. It's important to kind of interrupt this narrative to discuss the sources. So, 10 months later, Cortés was going to write down everything that he thought happened and sent a letter to Charles V. He said that on that day, Montezuma recognized in his speech in November 1519 that, in fact, the Europeans were long-lost gods or leaders whose return he had both expected and feared. Cortés reported that Montezuma admitted that the Mexica were in the beginning foreigners and had been led to the Valley of Mexico by a lord that they had been vassals to. Then Cortés went on, because Montezuma, according to him, described how, quote, the Lord brought us, the Mexica, to Tenochtitlan, and then went away to his native land. After a long time, he returned, found the people whom he had married locally, and had children, and had built towns on which to live. When he wished to lead them onward, they were reluctant, and he did not even wish to recognize them as leader, end quote. So he went away again. Quoting now again, and we have always held that those who descended from him would one day come back and take us as vassals. So, in essence, Montezuma was recognizing Charles V through Cortés as his vassal, believing them to be gods, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Montezuma was said by Cortés, again, to have added, quote, so be assured that we will obey you and hold you as our Lord, in the stead of that great Lord, in that there will be no mistake or deception of any kind, and in all the land which I hold in my power you can command as you will, for you will be obeyed. And since you are in your native country and in your own house, enjoy yourself and rest from the labor of your battles. So that's Cortés's account. Several other conquistadors wrote of the affair a bit differently in their accounts. Bernal Diaz, for example, who also wrote in the 1550s in Guatemala in Spain, recorded the speech quite shortly. Montezuma, he said, this is Diaz, insisted that, quote, now that he had us with him, he was at our service, and he would give us all that he possessed, and that it was surely true that we were those whom his ancestors had spoken of, when they talked of men who had come from where the sun rose to rule over the territory, end quote. Father Aguilar, another eyewitness who wrote in El Escritorio, this is back in Spain, in the 1560s, went further than Cortés in describing how Montezuma acted. He said that Montezuma announced himself before a notary, no less, to be king of Castile's vassal, declared that he would serve him as he would his own lord, that the Europeans were welcome, that they had come home, and that his ancestors had always said that armed, bearded men would one day come out of the sunrise, who were not to be fought against, since they were the future lords of the earth. Father Aguilar added that Montezuma, quote, believed us to be immortals and called us tueles, that is gods, end quote. Aguilar, however, was probably confusing this occasion with another one in January 1520 that I will talk about in an upcoming episode. To some extent, this speech is confirmed by Mexica sources. The so-called Crónica X, written in Natal in the 1530s, recounts the speech and does include the elements of submission. Certainly, Cortés was ruthless and devious, but it is unlikely that he would have just fabricated this speech out of whole cloth. Had he done so, he surely would have been denounced by other members of the expedition in the blaming and infighting that was going to follow. It is worth noting that in his letters back to Spain, Cortés never directly mentions that Montezuma believed he was a physical god. For my part, I think the submission speech was helpful for Cortés, but it didn't change anything. Had Montezuma rejected Spain's authority, it's not as though Cortés would have just shrugged, turned to his men and said, "Oh well, boys, guess it's back to Spain." All in all, Cortés replied, through Marina, of course, his translator, quote, "Have confidence, Montezuma, fear nothing. We love you greatly. Our heart today is well satisfied. We will see you, in your face we hear you. We have wished for a long time to see you, to hear you, to speak in person." Now, interestingly, the Mexican emperor and his nobility were probably just as surprised with the fact that Cortés was using a female interpreter, a young female interpreter, as the fact that a bunch of Europeans had just shown up. They would have been informed, of course, about the existence of Marina from their agents, but they would have never seen her or heard her at her work. As with the spokesman on the coast, they would have been amazed since she was a woman. They would have never seen a woman interpreter before. All that being said, the date was November 8th, 1519, and Cortés was finally in Tenochtitlan. If you're interested in more content, check out the link to the website in the show notes. If you'd like the whole story of Western Civ all over again, except especially in the beginning, better audio quality and more detail, check out the free link to Western Civ 2.0 in the show notes. And if you'd like ad-free versions of the show, check out the Patreon page. You can get them for $1 a month. Until next time.